إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. First and foremost, we are grateful to Allah Azza wa Jal that He's granted us this opportunity to commence this series of lectures that we are going to be presenting on Mustalah al-Hadith, and this is particularly important to distinguish between Mustalah al-Hadith and also Ulum al-Hadith, especially given the choice of book we are going to be studying, al-Manzumah al-Bayqūniyyah, al-Manzumah al-Bayqūniyyah. And too often we misunderstand Mustalah al-Hadith with Hadith sciences, and I generally prefer to think of Hadith sciences as Hadith art, because if you study it a little bit deeper, you realize it's more of an art than it is a science. And if we are going to call it a science, even it should be categorized with social sciences rather than some say actuarials or some statistical science. Okay, when a science has to do with statistics and numbers, then it turns out to be predictive. Hadith science, on the other hand, is more unpredictive than it is predictive. And this is precisely because Hadith science, if you could think of it as more of a study of human behavior, human nature as it applies in narrations, than it's simply a science that studies narrations. Okay, it has more to do with human behavior and human nature than it has to do with simply narrations. Now, we are going to be studying al-Manzumah al-Bayqūniyyah, and if you want, you could call it a benefit of studying Manzumah al-Bayqūniyyah is you don't have to take any time introducing the author or anything like that, because we really don't know so much about the author except that this is his book. Even his name, there's a debate as to why it's his name. So we are not even going to attempt to discuss all of this, because we would only be guessing. So he commences the poem with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and then he says, Abda'u bilhamdi musalliyan ala Muhammadin khayri nabiyyin ursila wa dhi min aqsamil hadithi iddah wa kullu wahidin ata wa hadda. So he says, Abda'u bilhamdi, I commence with praise, musalliyan, in the state of saying salah, in the state of sending peace and salutations, ala Muhammadin, upon Muhammad, khayri nabiyyin ursila, the best prophet that is ever sent, the best prophet that has ever been sent. Wa dhi min aqsamil hadithi iddah, and here is a collection of a number of hadith divisions, categorizations. But the proper translation or the proper interpretation of aqsam here would be anwa'. Okay, anwa' ulum al-hadith, and anwa' also represent categorizations, but a better interpretation would be terminologies, because like I was saying, there's a difference between Mustalah al-Hadith and Hadith science, and I didn't finish that up. Mustalah al-Hadith is a collection of terminologies that you would come across when you are reading the works of Hadith scholars. Okay, when you get into the practice of Hadith, these are the terminologies you are going to be saying. So Mustalah al-Hadith in particular does not teach you Hadith, the practice of Hadith sciences. It teaches you the terminologies. So I like to liken it to a dictionary. A dictionary teaches you vocabulary, but it does not necessarily teach you how to speak and how to compose poetry and all of that. Okay, to study that, you need to study some much more advanced linguistics, and you need to do some novel reading and so on and so forth. So similarly, Mustalah al-Hadith, Mustalah al-Hadith introduces you to these terminologies that you will come across when you begin practicing Hadith science and when you begin reading into Hadith science in some details. And he says, وَكُلُّ وَاحِدٍ أَتَى وَحَدَّ, and each. Okay, so I was mentioning this is Mustalah al-Hadith. Hadith science, on the other hand, although I sort of hinted to why it is, Hadith science, on the other hand, is a collection of different fields, okay, all of which help you to understand the history and development of the documentation and consolidation of hadith. the history and consolidation of hadith, okay, and also how to authenticate, okay, and also distinct what is authentic from to distinguish and distinct authentic narrations from inauthentic hadith. These are the sort of things that hadith science they basically do. And as you progress in the ladder of these sciences, you realize how these are done. وَكُلُّ وَاحِدٍ أَتَى وَحَدَّ. He said each division that has come in this book, each terminology that has come in this book it comes along with its definition. So those are the first two lines of the poem. And anything that doesn't have directly to do with Mustalah al-Hadith or Hadith science, we will not be explaining in details. We'll just translate, and if it has anything to do with Hadith science, then we will discuss in some details. So the first division he mentions, al-Hadith al-Sahih, and the books of Mustalah, they often start with al-Hadith al-Sahih li sharafihi wa jalalati, because it is noble and it is the point of studying Hadith science. Okay. He says أولها الصحيح وهو ما اتصل إسناده ولم يشذ أو يعل يرويه عدل ضابط عن مثله معتمد في ضبطه ونقله. He says أولها الصحيح. The first division we are going to be talking about in this book is الصحيح. Al-Hadith al-Sahih is often translated as sound, authentic. Okay, sound or authentic. These are the two terms that are often used to translate Al-Hadith al-Sahih. He says وَهُوَ مَتَّصَلْ, and it that which is connected isnaduhu in its chain, وَلَمْ يُشَذَّ, and it's not found to contain irregularities, أو يُعَلْ, and it's not found to contain hidden defects, hidden effective defects. And we'll be talking about each of these in details, inshallah. And in the fourth line, he says yarwihi adlun, and it's being recorded. Okay, it's being narrated by adlun. It's being narrated by a narrator who is trustworthy. Babitun, who is also accurate, who is meticulous in his academics and his scholarship. And mithlihi, from narrators that are similar to him in these sort of conditions, they are religiously trustworthy. And in terms of their academics and their scholarship, also they are meticulous and they are accurate and reliable. Mu'tamadun fi dhabtihi wa naqlihi, and in these narrators that he is narrating, these other narrators from whom he's narrating, is depending on their reliability and trustworthiness as well. So al-Hadith al-Sahih is the first division that is mentioned in this book, like we said, and he basically defines al-Hadith al-Sahih by using the conditions that make a hadith sahih. Okay, and so often when we talk about al-hadith al-sahih, we would have to discuss shurut al-sihha wal-qabul, the conditions that make a hadith authentic and that make a hadith acceptable. And this condition, you pay attention to them because they are the same conditions that are going to be guiding us. Okay, they are going to be guiding us anytime that these conditions can be proven to exist with the hadith, we say it's authentic. And if they can be proven not to exist, we say the hadith is not authentic. If they can be proven not to exist, we will say the hadith is not authentic. If we can prove them only to a certain point, okay, to attain a certain amount of certainty, a certain amount of sureness, then we could say the hadith is fairly authentic, which would bring us into the issues of Hasan and so on and so forth. So the first condition, so the first condition is ittisalu sanad, the connectivity of the chain. Ittisalu sanad, that the chain is connected. And let's try to historicize, let's try to contextualize this. So let's imagine that I was quoting someone from 400 years ago. I mean, without thinking deeper and harder, you know that I could not have been narrating directly from this person who lived 400 years ago. So I should have read it, or I should have heard someone saying it. If I'm reading it, then maybe it was written in some centuries earlier. But imagine that for a second that I was actually quoting someone else who I met. But if this original person lived some 400 years ago, then there's nobody I would be meeting in my life who would have heard it directly also from this person. So this person also should have heard it from someone. And so we would have to regress backwardly. We would have to retrogress backwardly to get to someone who must have lived with this individual who said it, and who is able to connect us to this individual. And this idea of trying to trace a narration back in time to a source, it brings the idea of isnad. It brings the idea of chain of narrators. And al-isnadu ra'su al-hadith, al-muhaddith. Isnad is the capital, is the capital of a muhaddith. A muhaddith who has no chain of narration then is no muhaddith. Okay, so this is the idea of the chain. Okay, now a lot of conditions we are going to be discussing about is going to revolve around this. And before we even continue, so imagine that these people we are tracing backwards, some of them were discovered not to have met. Then we would say that this story cannot be true because you are claiming you heard it from someone who also heard it from another person, but this person died before the next person was born. So how could he have heard it? Okay, he must have heard it through some intermediary. Okay, that is understandable. He must have heard it through some intermediary. But who is this intermediary? We don't know him. And if we don't know the intermediary, we cannot trust that the person is telling the truth or is fabricating the information. And this all brings us into different aspects of hadith science. And that's why I said I'd prefer that we think of it more as an art than a science. Because as we get deeper and deeper into it, you just realize that there are just so much things that you expected to go one way and they go the other way. Because real life does not module logic. Okay, real life is not logical. Okay, why would people cheat? Why would people... These things are not things you can explain logically. So real life tends to be more unpredictable than logic is. And this is not to say hadith science is not logical. It's precisely because it's logical that it watches out for the smallest change in real life rather than formulating static rules and formulas that do not change regardless of changes in circumstances and conditions of people. Anyway, so ittisal al-sanad then is that every narrator in the chain, and we just said you have to trace backward to narrate. You have to trace backwards in time through narrators. So each of these narrators should have taken the narration, should have taken the hadith directly from the person that they are narrating it from, and this brings the idea of ittisal al-sanad to a close. An example before we move on would be Imam Malik. Okay, Imam Malik, he famously studied under Nafi' Mawla bin Umar. Okay, Nafi', the free slave of Abdullah bin Umar. And Nafi' as well, he studied from Abdullah bin Umar. So if Malik then reports from Nafi', who reports from Abdullah bin Umar, who reports from Prophet ﷺ, we would see this chain is connected. Malik and Nafi' and Ibn Umar and Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This chain would be said to be connected because when we trace it backward, we would see that each of them has met the previous person, that each next person has met the previous person that they are narrating from. Imam Malik, he studied under Imam Nafi' Mawla bin Umar, and Nafi' he studied under his master Abdullah bin Umar, and Abdullah bin Umar is famously a Sahabi of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second condition is the second condition is as-salamatu min ash-shuzuzi. As-salamatu min ash-shuzuz. Now the hadith is free from irregularities, okay, inconsistencies, okay, that it does not have any inconsistencies, so such that if three people were narrating, they will not be contradicting themselves. If they are contradicting themselves, we would say this hadith has inconsistencies, especially inconsistencies in such a way that one of the narrators is less reliable and he's contradicting the other two, or he's contradicting the most reliable amongst them. Okay, I often like to give the example of a backbencher disagreeing with the shakos who are in the middle of the classroom. When a backbencher who is most often absent and who doesn't perform very well disagrees with the shakos in physics and chemistry, everyone is definitely going to be picking the side of the shakos who wear glasses rather than the side of the backbencher. So similarly in hadith science, we should not have a backbencher narrator narrating something inconsistently with the shakos in the class. So if several narrators narrate, they should be narrating the same thing, and there should not be any form of inconsistencies among their narration. So this is the second condition, as-salamatu min ash-shuzuz, that the narration be free from irregularities. And the simplest interpretation of Ash-shuzuz is that a narrator who is less reliable should not narrate contrary to those that are more reliable than himself. Number 3 is as-salamatu min al-illa al-qadiha, that the hadith, whether the chain or the matan, but mostly the chain, okay, that the hadith is free from hidden effective defects. Hidden effective defects, the effects, they are such defects that cannot be seen by ordinary students or scholars. It requires an expert hadith scientist, okay, hadith traditionist, to be able to spot, okay. What example would I give that would best explain this? Well, let just what example would I give? But basically al-illa, I want to give an example of coconut sellers, but this demonstrates the scholars who discover it more than the illa itself. So the example of a coconut seller, I would bring it later. But basically, if there's a collection of coconuts, right, and I pick them, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You know, these coconut sellers, you tell them that I want one that has water, one that has a softer fruit. They hold it and they are able to tell by shaking it, by heating it, they are able to tell. Now, if you give a hadith to an ordinary scholar, an ordinary student of knowledge, he will look at this hadith and he will not be able to tell if it has any problems. Only in the case of the coconut teller, he's trying to see if it has qualities we are looking for. Now, when we are talking of illa, the hadith scholar is looking at it to see if there are any problems that you would not see ordinarily. So he takes it, he looks at the hadith, and he does some gymnastics and he's able to, this hadith has some hidden problems, and then you could then investigate and confirm that such problems truly do exist. The fourth condition, which is taken from Yarwihi Adlun, is adalatul ruwa, that the narrators, they are religious, okay, the narrators are religious, and this is such that we are sure that they will not be telling a lie. So this condition is important, to be sure that the narrator will not be telling a lie. So it requires that they be pious, they be modest, and so on and so forth. And finally, the fifth condition is dabtur ruwa, that the narrators are accurate. The narrators are accurate. And what this condition implies is that the narrator is well trained and well educated, so much so that when they hear a narration, when they take a lesson in hadith, they are able to preserve it up to such a time, until such a time that they teach it the same way that they received it, without making any changes that give up on the meaning of what it is that they were narrating. So these are basically the 5 conditions of a hadith that is authentic. Ittisalu sanad, as-salamatu min ash-shuzuz, as-salamatu min al-illa al-qadiha, adalatul ruwat, and dabtur ruwat. These are the 5 conditions for a hadith to be authentic. And when we put these conditions together, we will be able to define an authentic hadith. Authentic hadith as a hadith that is narrated through a connected chain made of narrators who are both reliable and accurate in their narrations. Until we meet again next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallah bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.